Ever since the Renaissance, nations have used gold as the de facto reserve currency, in one way or another. Way before the Renaissance, one of the reasons why the Byzantine Empire survived was because they were forced to adopt gold as a currency, since hordes arriving at Constantinople could be dealt with by bribing them rather than by fighting them, and the barbarians demanded gold as payment. The Western Roman Empire, on the other hand, suffered from hyperinflation as a result of debasement of the denarius, the silver coinage they used, and was never able to regain its stability. Okay, what's so special about gold? Well, gold is a natural currency because of its high stock-to-flow ratio, i.e. the mined stock per year is too small relative to the existing stock. This gives gold a yearly inflation of around 1.5%. The problem with gold as a currency is that it's difficult to transport and protect. In fact, the Byzantines adopted gold as the official currency, but the public still had a fiat currency for everything except paying taxes. Therefore, to pay taxes, people need to exchange their fiat for gold such that they could pay their taxes in gold. This gave the government in the Eastern Roman Empire the ability to balance the budgets on a currency with 1.5% yearly inflation. So Europe ends up getting out of the Dark Ages, and once again gold is a currency, but then Spain discovers the Americas and brings lots of gold back to Europe. This sudden introduction of gold ironically led to high inflation and effectively destroyed its economy. However, it also gave Europe as a whole a golden age, pardon the pun, since a stable and now abundant currency was introduced. Eventually, in the 19th and 20th century, gold was used as the reserve of fiat currencies. This meant that governments were forced to balance budgets since they could not print more gold. At the end of World War II, however, the world powers came together at the Bretton Woods conference to create a new world trade system, but there were a few problems. First of all, the Soviets did not attend. Secondly, the Soviets had a very strong army relative to the Western powers in Europe. Third, all Western powers, except the United States, were pretty much destroyed after World War II. The idea was to avoid the problems that gold had by creating a global currency called a bancor, so central banks could trade with each other and devalue against that currency if needed. This was conceptualized by John Maynard Keynes and Ernst Friedrich Schumacher and proposed by the United Kingdom after World War II. However, the United States smartly opposed this idea, since in the case of the Soviets marching west, only they could finance the defense of Europe. So at the Bretton Woods conference, instead of the bancor, something else happened. A new currency, Chad, was in town. The US dollar was adopted as the global reserve currency backed by gold, and all other currencies were going to be backed by the US dollar. In the case of a war with the Soviets, the US could inflate the US dollar and break the parity to finance the defense of Europe if needed. But that did not happen, of course. What did happen is that after the Korean War and the Vietnam War and the increase in domestic spending, the US dollar broke parity with gold. This was all fine up until a certain point. The US dollar was convertible to gold, and countries such as France demanded the gold in exchange for US dollars. The game theory behind Bretton Woods was very simple. Nations were forced to balance budgets since they could not print US dollars. The United States was forced to balance budgets since it could not print gold. However, in 1971, to prevent other nations from completely draining US gold reserves, President Richard Nixon halted the convertibility of US dollars for gold. This was the end of the gold standard, and the world entered into something that hadn't happened since the Dark Ages, a system based on nothing. The United States could print whatever it wanted, and other countries could also print whatever they wanted, since now all countries were floating against each other. Now, this is fine as long as there is demand for those inflated currencies. If the velocity of money goes up, it is, to an extent, irrelevant how much you print since the demand for said currency also goes up, right? The problem is that disconnecting currency from gold, which had natural low inflation, caused massive damage from a game theory perspective because number one, politicians could inflate without problem, number two, balancing budgets became irrelevant, and number three, they could change the definition of inflation to hide it. So first they removed real estate from inflation indexes, and we went from one worker being able to buy a house with 2 years of minimum wage in 1971 to one worker needing a good job to buy a house with a 15-year mortgage in 1980, to one worker needing a really good job to buy a house with a 15-year mortgage in 1990, to one husband and wife both needing good jobs to buy a house with a 30-year mortgage in the 2000s. This is happening because currency was disconnected from a real good with real inflation: gold. The US dollar index measures the value of the US dollar relative to other fiat currencies. These other fiat currencies regularly devalue against the US dollar to keep their parity. Every time the US dollar index goes down, Bitcoin, which has low inflation, goes up. Basically, it's a road to ruin since every currency is devaluing against each other. The ratio of the US dollar to the euro could stay the same for 10 years, but relative to real estate, for example, both have lost their value. Since 1971, we have been living in an insane experiment, and the troubling aspect for some is that the asset owners benefit from this experiment, which is leading society to feudalism. The elites seem to have a plan of UBI, central bank digital currencies, and of course the Great Reset. But remember, UBI is just feudalism, where instead of paying your lord every year, the inflation they create is the tribute you pay. Really take notice of the US dollar index and the price of Bitcoin. Something serious is brewing. The future of human civilization and its progression could be dependent on Bitcoin enforcing a new monetary standard, the hardest form of money to ever exist. All other paths lead to feudalism.